for the last couple of years, actually, I was involved in investigating into the crisis of the Enlightenment, as it seemed that a lot of the practice that I was surrounded by and that I was also influenced by was very much based on the tradition of the Enlightenment, namely a leftist, critical, artistic practice, and that it seemed like the crisis was so obvious that it made it impossible to go on with the same methodology or with the same kind of strategies that one had applied to the issues that we found necessary or important to raise and to investigate in. And especially since in the tradition of Enlightenment, knowledge is mainly and very strongly linked to visualization, image production became a very, very important part of, or a very important focus of this research. How are images produced, and what is this strong tie to objectivism that, especially in the left tradition, that we try to, or that we tried to avoid any kind of emotional attachment to the images that we produce, but rather to have this purely critical approach that would leave it open to the observer or to the audience to make their own, to have their own thoughts about it, and to come to the very obvious conclusion that there is an objective truth, which is injustice, or which is you know, the wrong and the right, and that it doesn't come from an affect that the images produces, but rather from the facts that are embedded in the images, or in the knowledge that is produced by the images. And a lot of people, or a lot of people that I've been working with, felt the need that this needs to be discussed again. And there was this really amazing and helpful lecture that Greg Borowitz gave once in New York that I had the chance to attend, and he also made this very strong claim that we have to confront again what the role of affect and the role of an emotional attachment to or to a subjective truth also is a political means that we have to consider in the work if we don't want to remain speechless towards the current situations and the current questions that were so beautifully raised earlier on. And I think in that sense also it's helpful, or it came about that most of the research or the work that was produced in the last couple of years comes from an uniconic or I don't know, I'm careful with iconoclastic position, but Sven sort of made this point that most of the work that I produced recently has this kind of connection. Where I would say that the helpful thing that Sven raised also in his essay that he wrote for the Critical Reader is that there is several traditions of iconoclasms or of aniconisms, and it's very important to understand that they are not all religiously motivated, and that talking about affect doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, or turning away from the traditional. It's better to take it that way. To turn away from the traditional approach to the Enlightenment doesn't necessarily mean that one has to go back to religion. But that if you take Tom Keenan's approach, who was really important in our research, and who you will see later on in the conversation that I had with him recently in New York, where he demands a radicalization of all enlightenments. He also takes the plural forms. He says that there's not just one enlightenment, and that this radicalization of the enlightenments doesn't necessarily happen in bright daylight, which means it's not where you shed the light and where something is where something becomes visible. That's not necessarily where this radicalization happens, but it rather happens in the shadows. It happens in the darkness. So one has to actually confront, or has to confront the shadows, or has to move to the dark zones and to see what is there, and how can I talk to it. So that's basically what I've been involved in, and part of the work is collaborative. Part of it I have been doing on my own, but it's always in discussion with friends and colleagues. And the work that is presented here in the exhibition, The Art of Iconoclasm, is a work that is inspired by a novel, a post-punk novel by Kathy Ecker called Empire of the Senseless. She wrote it in 1988, and it's a very strange novel. I don't know if any of you have read Kathy Ecker. I always had a big problem reading her because of very graphic use of very violent and violent language. In that novel, for the first time, I could very much relate to it, and I could understand the necessity of the violence and of this total destruction of language. And the story of this novel is that there's these two lovers. They are actually terrorists, and one of them is half human, half robot. Her name is Abhor, and her lover is Tivai. He's a pirate, and in the novel they never speak for themselves. They always speak for each other. So one chapter would start with Tivai says, and then he would start with I, Abhor, do this and that. So it's this constant confusion of who's who, of identities and of gender roles. And this whole love story is embedded in a completely destroyed and decaying Paris, in a post-revolutionary Paris, where Algerian men and women have made a revolution, have taken over the city, and turned it into a devastated landscape of decay, and it's not only in the urban sense of this destruction of architecture. It's the destruction of all sort of social status, of all sort of class, gender roles, and anything is is in a state of falling apart, but at the same time in the state of becoming. So these two main characters, they are basically in a constant state of becoming. You can't really say what, but it's really this play of language where once you have an image, it's already falling apart again, and it's very strong, and it's the violence is obviously the violence that returns to the oppressor, the Algerian War coming home, and while it's a revolutionary situation, at the same time it's multi-layered. There's all these different influences. There's the CIA. There's some called white Americans that are also involved in the fate of the city. So there's multiple layers of influences, and the conflicts and aggravations, they somehow, or this sort of constant upheaval of values, of names, of statuses, comes close to a sort of carnivalesque situation. And to quote, this nothing society, this nothingness being every possibility, heralds total carnival. And in the, just for the ones who haven't seen the exhibition yet, the work shown in the exhibition is part one of Empire of the Senses, part one. There's two parts. Part one is an installation that consists of several sensors, regular sensors, and when you enter a room, light goes on and off, and while you go through the room, the light goes on and off where you walk, and the light charges a text that is written with phosphorescent paint at the far wall at the end, which is a quote from Kathy Ecker and from Kathy Ecker's novel. And you can only read the text when you stand still, when you don't move, because only then it becomes dark and the text becomes visible. The text, I don't know if you can read the text. Yeah, maybe I read it. It's maybe from the distance. It's too difficult. Don't touch me, but whip my cunt, the young whore said to me. I'm not a brute, I told her. It's wrong for any human to hurt or kill another human, even to reject to the point of banishment another human. Corporate executives commit atrocities. Must we act like them sexually in order to fight them successfully? No, I was answering myself. Acting like shits will only make us become shits. Greedy and maniacal. Of course we have to use force to fight for our freedom, for forceless humans are dead. We should use force to fight representations which are idols, idolized images. We must use force to annihilate, erase, eradicate, terminate, destroy, slaughter, slay, nullify, neutralize, break down, get rid of, obliterate, move out, destruct, end all representations which exist for purposes other than enjoyment. In such a war against idolatry, ridicule be our best tool. Remember, whore, Julian's sarcasm did more damage than Nero's tortures. Decomposing flesh moves me the most, the young whore said. Give me hell. Part two of Empire of the Senseless is a video installation. I will try to. It's a bit difficult to reproduce here because it's you have to stand between the two projectors. But just to give you an idea, it's two projections, and they project words onto the same spot, onto the wall, and it's a complete list of all the names that people give each other or themselves in the novel. It's a list of a couple of thousand words, and only if you walk in between the two projections you can actually read it, because one will be projected onto your shadow, the other one will be projected onto your back. Maybe we can just I just skip through it a little bit so. And Kathy Ecker says, I mean, she has this really strong struggle with language, but for me, also one reason I think why she uses this very graphic language is that the words are really as strong as images. They project onto people, and she tries to destroy this hegemony of language. She says, don't believe in human speech as anything but a stuff of time. So here you can see how it works in the... So what I was really impressed by was the way that she addresses colonialism, and where in the novel there is these moments where people where in this moment of becoming lies this very potential that is empowering without being romantic or without being utopian. And yeah, I found that very important as a strategy. So in a sense, the work is a tribute to that. To that book. There's a book that is somehow related to it. It's the book by Malik Alula about the colonial postcards that were taken of Algerian women, and he wrote a very impressive text about the relationship between the photographer and the veiled woman, and I just want to read you a couple of passages from it. The whiteness of the veil becomes the symbolic equivalent of blindness. A leucoma, a white speck on the eye of the photographer and on his viewfinder. Whiteness is the absence of a photo, a veiled photograph, a whiteout in technical terms. From its background, nothing emerges except some vague contours, anonymous in their repeated resemblance. Nothing distinguishes one veiled woman from another. He goes on about like why you would always photograph veiled women in through groups and never alone. These veiled women are not only an embarrassing enigma to the photographer, but an outright attack upon him. It must be believed that the feminine gaze that filters through the veil is a gaze of a particular kind. Concentrated by the tiny orifice for the eye, this womanly gaze is a little like the eye of a camera, like the photographic lens that takes aim at everything. The photographer makes no mistake about it. He knows this gaze well. It resembles his own when it is extended by the dark chamber or the viewfinder. Thrust in the presence of a veiled woman, the photographer feels photographed. Having himself become an object to be seen, he loses initiative. He is dispossessed of his own gaze. This varied experience of frustration is turned by the photographer into the sign of his own negation. Algerian society, particularly the feminine world within it, threatens him in his being and prevents him from accomplishing himself as gazing gaze. There's some parallels with, I mean, just to briefly go back to this. This is a page from the book that we published with this project. No matter how bright the light, the crossing occurs at night, and this is one of the women that is depicted on one of the colonial postcards that Malek Alula talks about. The other one is just an image that I found in the Corbis website from a fashion photo shoot. But I found the relationship between the two ways, or the two strategies of trying to establish a relationship with the camera interesting to compare. And masking oneself can become part of a revolutionary practice. I mean, in the example of the Algerian women, if you've seen Battles of Algiers, the film, some of the women carry weapons or other goods under their hijab, so they use this zone that is not accessible also in a very literal sense in the battle, not only in the sense of a visual negotiation, but this visual blockade, the mask, is also used by other revolutionaries. This is Subcomandante Marcos, the very famous spokesperson of the Zapatista movement in Mexico. And Michael Tausig wrote he's an anthropologist, a very political one, I would say. He wrote a text or a book about the notion of defacement, and he takes Subcomandante Marcos as an example of a defacer, of somebody who questions the name of an event, and he does that by the strategy of masking himself, confronting the seemingly unmasked state power, which in the process of this confrontation, it just becomes obvious that the state is masked as well. And so the mask that he uses becomes a tool in the negotiation. The strategy of defacement that Tausig describes deals with the understanding that secrecy is at the heart of power, that there's always something hidden, but it's actually an open secret. It's everybody knows that it's there, and this dialectics of concealment and revelation is part of a revolutionary struggle, and the Zapatistas are very conscious about that. And what Tausig says is the advantage of the revolutionary in comparison to the state power is that he can use mimesis as well as metaphor, where the state can only use mimesis, and the use of metaphor makes his action poetic, and poetry is sort of the answer, or the tool that empowers the revolutionary. I'm not so sure whether I'm very clear, because it's a very complex thing that he describes, and now as I notice, trying to cut it short is a bit difficult. But it's the struggle for a sovereign individual, not only in the sense of this dual situation between state power and revolutionary, but basically as a strategy confronting all sorts of power situations. He names, apart from the defacer, he names also the hysteric, the revolutionary, the hysteric, and the defacer. They're sort of one and the same, as they are all not taking what is supposedly real. They're not taking that for granted, but they are saying, why do you say this is the real? Where most of the real that is stated by, for example, by the state, is actually made up, this notion of asking the name of the event was a starting point for a seminar that took place in New York at the New Museum last year. It was part of the night school project that Anton Vidokle organized, and it consisted of 3 nights, where the first night was an introduction in the ideas of idolatry. It was introduced by showing these, or we made these blackboards that had very simple iconic drawings of several aspects that we discussed, and it was a sort of ridiculed school situation, where you can see the image of the mask, and the second and third night left the museum, and we went to a nearby organic supermarket. It's called Whole Foods. It's the largest organic supermarket in the US, a chain, and it's just around the corner from the museum. Both have opened very recently. They're both indicate a gentrification of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and somehow this, I mean, they sort of are part of the same problem, but the supermarkets seem to me to have to offer a variety of starting points for a discussion of how to connect knowledge that that leads to action, a revolutionary knowledge, or a knowledge that that is involved in theory, but uses that theory to address actual issues that one wants to change. And so I invited two people, Avery Gordon and Tom Keenan, to have a conversation at the supermarket in order to shift the situation of a theoretical discussion into like the arena of practical decision making. And we actually, the idea was to hold the whole seminar at Whole Foods, but that wasn't possible because they didn't give us permission. So we had to use a spy camera and wireless microphones to record the conversations and then go back to the auditorium of the museum and play back there and have the discussion there. So I want to show you two excerpts of the conversation I had with Tom Keenan. He wrote the book that I mentioned earlier that demands the radicalization of the Enlightenment. But he's very active in human rights activism, but he's also very critical about it, and his criticism often reflects the use of imagery or the image politics in human rights activism, where one of his recent articles, The Mobilization of Shame, that he's going to talk about, questions whether this traditional understanding of revealing something that has happened, and then by that assuming that, you know, if this will be shown to the general public, something will change. This is kind of like the traditional strategy of human rights activist groups, that this doesn't apply to a lot of the situations anymore that we have to confront, where a lot of the imagery that we get to see is actually performed. It's not some sort of authentic image that one has distracted from the reality, but it's an image that is made to be seen. And so his question is, how do we deal with images that are not, in that sense, able to mobilize shame anymore in the way that the traditional prevalence of something that was hidden was able to do. So I have to unplug this computer because the sound, we have a sound problem here, and it seems like this works a little better than this one, so I have to unplug this. You're the director of the Human Rights Project and associate professor of comparative literature at Bard College, and you work in the fields of human rights, and you have worked with different organizations, among them Soros Documentary Fund, Witness, and the Journal of Human Rights. And you're the author of a book that was really important to us, Feelings of Responsibility, Aberrations and Predicaments in Ethics and Politics, that our project that we did with Ines and Ansa was based on. And today I wanted to discuss with you two more recent texts that you have written. One is translations, or Can Things Get Any Worse? It's, as I understood, it's a text that you did for the Dictionary of War.
South Atlantic Quarterly, a special issue on human rights.
Yeah. So in mobilizing shame, and actually in both texts, you talk about the connection between knowledge and action, and the complications that occur in some of the current situations that you look at. And I remember last time you mentioned a Laden tape when we talked about knowledge is for acting on.
Yeah.
And that sounds so good, but it seems like at least in our practice or in our understanding of things, this seems to be rather complicated today. And one part of this complication that you describe in mobilizing shame is that the strategies of human rights groups that are based on revealing injustice or revealing violence or other types of obnoxious things, that it doesn't work anymore. You know, that these images or the revealing of these images doesn't produce the emotion or the state of shame that we're mentioned is what it's based on. So I was wondering whether you could describe this relation between revealing something and how shame is produced, and what kind of role it plays, and why it doesn't do that anymore.
Well, it might still do it. I mean, it's not a historical argument. So I think there's many times when, in fact, the revelation of atrocities does have some kind of effect. But what I was interested in was two different ways of conceiving the political function of images. And the Martin tape, or in general, the notion of the photo opportunity, whether it's produced by the American Army arriving on the beach in Mogadishu, or the president offering a press conference, or that sort of event. That strikes me as one increasingly important dimension of political image making, the staged image, sort of like what we're doing here, right? Where the event happens in order to be photographed and reproduced and rebroadcast and so on. And it seems to me that that's epistemologically, that's a very different kind of thing than the role we traditionally associate with images, which is of making something that's otherwise hard to see visible, making something and converting observation or visualization into knowledge in the hopes that, or with the expected result of some kind of action that's based on a rational, reasonable, deliberate interpretation of those images. And it seems to me that that's still, although a great deal of political practice now takes place in the realm of the photo opportunity or the performance or the, whether it's a trophy kind of photo opportunity or a provocative photo opportunity. A great deal of practice happens with that kind of image, but a great deal of analysis or political interpretation happens with the other kind of image. So that, and in particular, on the side of activists for social justice or human rights organizations, or and even sometimes less advocacy-oriented practitioners. So there the idea is, if we can not only see something, but create a visual representation of that thing, we will make it known to a wider public, and there is a whole theory of the public sphere and the democratic, rational public sphere and so on there. That if things become known, then the actions which ought to be taken because of what we now know will more or less follow logically or entrained. And it seems to me that that often misses a more properly political moment, which is trying to inscribe those images in a narrative or in a persuasive project in some kind of campaign, which actually narrates them or captions them or makes them more available for some kind of political action, rather than just taking for granted that their meaning follows automatically, or that the action follows automatically from the meaning that's seen. And so I guess, what I'm interested in is again, I don't know if it's a historical argument or not, that what seems to be the declining efficacy of that revelation, that model of the epistemological model of revelation and exposure, and the increasing prominence of the photo opportunity and the performance, the stage, as a way of working with images politically. So I don't want to go as far as to say they don't work anymore, because I think they're still actually, I would not want to be the one who proposed that we stop trying to know things and stop trying to make pictures and render things visible and so on. But to think that totally covers the field of the preparation for action, I think misses the way in which this performative dimension already involves a kind of action that maybe doesn't pass through the same cognitive circuits or the same process of knowing as maybe we thought it did. I don't know, does that make sense?